the cloud. Oh yeah, thanks, Sakirati, appreciate it. So we're recording now. Let me quickly check if I'm not sure if the Facebook Live also cut off, but anyway, I don't care too much if it did, because no, anyway, I shouldn't say that. Back to the lecture. So the point was that there are these three tattvas. There's the Bhagavan, who's basically the sum bonum of everything, you could say. And then Bhagavan has these shaktis, the Svarup Shakti, or the internal potency, and the Jiva Shakti, which is us, the living entities. And then there's the Maya Shakti, or illusion. And so Bhaktivinoda, he was very much emphasizing this for the reason that he's trying to establish what is, according to Gaudiya Vedanta, what is the true function of the soul. And if you want to explain a true function of an object or a thing, you really have to explain how it relates to the rest of the world or reality to really explain what that true function of that being or that object is. For example, if you try to explain what the dharma of a car is, the car has no meaning in itself. It's always relational. It's always in relation to something else, in this case to humans and their need or desire to move around, transportation. So that's why Bhaktivinoda is emphasizing these different tattvas, these three different tattvas: Bhagavan, Jivas, and Maya, or the material energy. Because to really understand what our true nature is as Jivas, we have to understand the kind of the field that we act in, and basically the reality that we are a part of, what that constitutes. And so in this explanation, Bhaktivinoda is very much emphasizing the difference of the jivas from the rest of the existence and from Bhagavan, because he really wants to drive the point in. First of all, who he's talking to is a Mayavadi sannyasi who was a sannyasi for 12 years before showing up. So he's hammering this point that the ultimate goal is not to merge, and we're not monists in that strict sense that there's only one substance and an illusion of duality or whatever. And so from that point of view, it's very important, of course, what Bhaktivinoda is doing, that he's showing that even in the post-liberated state, according to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there is always the lover and the object of love, and that never goes away. Although that then the Veda-Bade, there's the Bade and Abade, so difference and non-difference. And so the Abeda side is very important. And Bhaktivinoda doesn't emphasize this in the first chapter because he's laying the foundation for praying, basically, that requires the two. But really, I think for us as sadhakas and as practitioners in the West and in the global world, it's very important also to point out, even to non-devotees, that it's never a duality in the pure sense. What we believe is the inconceivable duality and oneness at the same time. And if you think about the nature of praying, the descriptions, of course, we don't have experience of it. We have some faint flashes of some kind of bhava sometimes. But if you think about how prema has been described, it's very much an intense unity, so much so that in the madness of the gopis, when they were left behind by Krishna after the rasa dance, they started thinking that they were Krishna. Of course, they were not. They never were Krishna, but in their madness, their identification was so intense with the love of God and with Krishna himself that they actually thought in that moment that they are Krishna. And so they started acting out these leelas of Krishna as if they were Krishna, like, somebody was the Kaliya snake and one gopi would, I guess, jump on the other gopi's back and ride the snake like Krishna did out of the lake and stuff like that. So that, I think that's a very important point for us sadhakas to remember, that we're not like separate from God in the way of like distance, like we're here and God is, 1,700,000,000 miles away that direction in some like planet sitting on a throne, And that's sometimes how it's spoken about, but really that's just to use language to kind of use our frame of reference as embodied beings to like try to have us get a handle on the fact that we are derived beings, or like dependent beings who have this relationship with the ultimate reality, or with reality itself, who is a person. My Guru Maharaj likes to make this really fantastic point. He's a real like a champion of these one-liner zingers. So he says, reality is a person and it's not you, or you're not it, or something like that. I really very much like that one. One of my favorites, I would say. But anyway, I better move on here. I get like stuck on these points because there's so much to say about each of these points, but let me just move on here so we can get to the actual chapter for today. So today we're going to move on to the second chapter, which is called The Nitya-dharma of the Jiva is Pure and Eternal. So if you don't remember the terms, nitya-dharma means like the constitutional function of the soul. So the constitutional function of the soul is pure and eternal, is the name of today's chapter, the second chapter of Jaiva Dharma. And the chapter starts with two questions. There's been, Premdas Babaji Maharaj has been in this like continuous state of ecstasy and praying. So Sannyasi Thakur hasn't been able to ask him a lot of questions. But then an opening, comes and Sannyasi Thakur is just like burning to ask all these questions, because he's been for 12 years, he's been a sannyasi and he hasn't had the spiritual taste. And now he's finally has connected with his guru and is getting these answers that are just like pure chocolate cake for him. He's just like gorging on it. But it's, you can imagine if you're super hungry and you have this like feast in front of you, but you can't access it because the feast is in Mahabhav. You can imagine how I would feel. So now, finally, Premdas Babaji comes out of his samadhi, and Sannyasi Thakur asks him these two questions. So, based on the fact that in the first chapter, Premdas Babaji Maharaj has been talking about turning away from God, and like when we are, he was using this language like when we are created, then first we have our true dharma, but then we come in contact with some other objects or circumstances that change our true dharma into this nisarga, into this like acquired nature. And so then Sannyasi Thakur seems to be confused about this, and then he asks, his first question is, well, actually, that's the second question. But the first question is, if the jiva is infinitesimall, because this is what and the jiva. So then Premdas Babaji asks, if the jiva is infinitesimal, like tiny, 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 how can his eternal full and pure? Basically, I mean, that's a really good question. Like, if your being is not like complete and pure and like the totality of existence, how can your dharma as that being be pure and complete? So a very good question, of course. And then the second question is, if the natural function of the jiva is formed at the time he is constituted, and that relates to okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good. Freeze number one. Let's see how many more we're going to get. So, Ananga, did you guys hear the second question or no? Okay, so I'll repeat the second question. Second question was, if the natural function of the jiva is formed at the time he is constituted, how can that function be eternal? Because there's a beginning in time, and it seems like it's given at the time of the jiva's creation or something. And that, like I mentioned, that question must have sprung from the fact that Babaji Maharaj was talking about the time of conditioning coming on at a certain period of time, and like at a certain time in history, or however you want to mention it. So then Babaji Maharaj starts answering, and he says basically that when we talk about the minuteness of the jiva, that's only to, let's see, he worded it, Bhaktivinoda words it in a really cool way. He says, minuteness is only a trait by which the jiva is identified. And so my understanding what that sentence means is that just to separate between the jivas and Bhagavan, Krishna, you have to point out the smallness of the jiva, but in a way it's all the same Shakti. And so in that way, the minuteness is just a way of talking about the jivas, but it's really, in some ways you can't really separate the jivas like that. It's just a way of talking about it. I have to think about that a little more. I'm not fully clear on it, but I thought I had a sense of it, but I wasn't able to put it to words like I thought I could. But anyway, we can talk, I can bring that up later on when I think about it a little more. And so then Babaji Maharaj goes on to explain that actually the jivas are inseparable from Krishna, and that we have all the same qualities. We're like, in some ways, you could say we are constituted of the same substance, which is, in the Vedantic terms, is Satchit Ananda, which means we're eternal. We have eternal existence, or we are eternal existence. We're conscious, and we are constituted of bliss, basically. And so we are Satchit Ananda, and Krishna is Satchit Ananda. And in that way, we are of the same substance. We're qualitatively, we're of the same substance, but then my Guru Maharaj says, but quantitatively, we're not. And that really is, in this like simplistic way, that is what the difference is between us and God. But it's good to remember that we really are like an extension of the Paramatma. And that Bhaktivinoda explains this in his Chaitanya Shikshastamrita. I think it's just, yeah. And so basically he says we're extensions of the Paramatma. And because the Gaudiya preachers want to like separate our conception from the typical impersonalist conception of complete merging with the absolute, they really emphasize the difference a lot. But Okay, that was, yeah, freeze number 2. I'm keeping count. So I don't know if you guys heard what I said last. I said I was talking about how it's good for sadhakas to focus after we get over the hump of like understanding that we are separate from God in the way that we can't ever, well, we can, but we don't want to fully merge into him. After that, it's very useful for sadhakas to understand how closely connected to God we are, how we really are the same energy in a way. I mean, we're not, and we are in a way that we are Jiva Shakti and Shakti, but in a way we are the same energy, that we are actually this extension of the Paramatma in the Jivas that are here in the world. We have extended out of the Paramatma. We're kind of like the Paramatmas glow in these like tiny little specks. So like, to me, that's very beautiful to focus on that like understanding that we are never separate from God. We have absolutely no existence outside of the existence of God. And that we actually are these like sparkles of God. It's a very, I mean, to me, it's like a beautiful idea, and very useful to focus on that in my sadhana and understanding of like what we truly are. But maybe more on that later, because I have a lot of ground to cover here. And then Premdas Babaji Maharaj goes on to explain that the reason really why, to answer the first question, how is it that we have a full perfect Dharma, although we're so imperfect ourselves? He goes on to explain that in the Baddha Jiva condition, or the conditioned state of a Jiva, we are, fallible and weak and powerless. But as nitya-siddha Jivas, the kind of like beings that never had the material experience, they are like powerful, because they are completely connected to God. They're like God's extensions in the real sense of being just like this. How do you explain it? Even like describe it? Maybe this, some kind of like God's frequency, like radiating or something. The Jivas are so closely connected to God that they are extremely powerful. And Babaji Maharaj wants to point that out to Sannyasi Thakur, that we as Jivas have this weakness only when we are conditioned because of our minuteness. But in fact, Jivas are part of the Satchidananda reality, which is unlimitedly powerful. And then Babaji Maharaj goes on to explain how, again, he emphasizes how the Jiva's eternal Dharma, or the nitya-dharma, is Krishna-prema. And the nature of that pure love is service to Krishna. That's really what it means. And earlier in the first chapter, Babaji Maharaj actually quoted the famous verse, Jiva Svarupoi Krishna Nitya-das, Krishna Svarup Shakti Beta Beta Prakash. And so I'm just a slight detour here, because there's been a lot of talk about the inherency of bhakti in the Gaudiya world. Our Padmanabha Maharaj has been forging quite the fight in the Gaudiya scene. I mean, it's obviously not his fault, but there's been quite the rumble about this issue. And so a lot of times this verse is quoted to show that bhakti is inherent. But it's really interesting that in this context, Bhaktivinoda, when he quotes that verse, right after the verse, he goes on to give all these examples of how he gives this long list of things like that we are like the rays of the sun, or the particles of the sun, and Krishna is the sun, and Krishna is infinite, and we're infinitesimal. And Krishna is the Lord, and we're his servants, and he's the attractor, and we are the attracted. And he goes on to like many examples like that. And then he says that therefore, this is a direct quote, therefore the eternal svabhav or dharma of the living entity is Krishna dasya, eternal service and obedience to Krishna. So really what he's saying is, the verse is saying that we're servants of Krishna because he is the sum total of everything, and we're these tiny sparks of Krishna. In that context, he's not saying that we are Krishna Nitya Das because we have prem in our hearts, but he's saying because of this, what would you call it, this power dynamic, we are the eternal servants of the whole because we're tiny parts of the whole and we can never be separate from the whole. Just a little side point about that particular point. So then Babaji Maharaj goes on to explain how the, is it freezing again? Okay, good. No freezing. Babaji Maharaj goes on to explain 3 levels of ego. And so to like kind of explain how these different kind of dharmas come to being. Like there's one eternal dharma for the jivas, but somehow we have all these different conceptions of dharma. And so how that happens is we have our pure spiritual ego. And then somehow this material contamination or illusion covers it over. And at first it covers over the, it's called linga sarira, and it basically means the subtle body. Sarira means body. So it covers over the subtle body, and you get the sense, a separate sense of self. That's the basis of the subtle bodies or the mental bodies, false identification. You have the sense that you are something else than an eternal part of God. And then that goes further into you based on that like mental image of yourself, this body comes forward, or bodies, like material bodies come forward. And that's when that like sense of separate self gets these different forms. Like I'm a man, I'm a woman, whatever it is, whatever you can think of. I'm a dog, a squirrel, a brahmana, a shudra, vaishya, so on. And that's where the huge variety of dharmas spring from, because based on that false identification, we think that our constitutional function is something that's actually just the covering that is covering our true function. And so that's where all the different dharmas spring. And then Babaji Maharaj goes on further to explain different types. He separates the different types of dharmas into 3 categories. He says there's nitya-dharma, naimittika-dharma, and anitya-dharma. And nitya-dharma basically means that there's an understanding of Bhagavan, Krishna, and love for God, and that the soul is eternal, and that the soul's function is to love God. That's the nitya-dharma idea. And the naimittika-dharma idea is that the soul understands that there's God, and that the soul is eternally existent, but it's not interested because of desires. It's not interested in pursuing love of God. And so then from that springs all these temporary or acquired nature and temporary dharmas or duties and desires. And then the last one is anitya dharma, which means a temporary religion or temporary dharma. And the characteristics of that are that it doesn't recognize God or love of God or the eternality of the soul. And in this context, Bhaktivinoda says that Buddhism is an extreme example of anitya dharma, or non-eternal religion. And this is a heavy statement for us, and we'll go more into this whole issue a little later, but just bear with me a little bit more. Then after hearing this explanation, Sannyasi Thakur asks, he has a question about the advaita siddhi, or the highest goal or attainment of advaita vad, or the impersonalist Mayavadi doctrine. And he asks that, is this the same as what Mahabhav is, which is the highest reach of prema? Are these two attainments the same thing? And he's a little embarrassed to ask it, because I think he's, guessing what the answer is, but he still says, this is in my heart and I don't want to hide anything from you because you're my guru. I want to be completely honest with you. So that's my question. And then Prem Das Babaji goes into this long explanation of who Shankar actually was. And the Gaudiya take on Shankaracharya is that he's actually Shiva himself. And that there was a reason for Shiva to appear as Shankar, because there was this prevalence of Buddhism in India at the moment, and part of Buddhism is that they reject the Vedas and the eternality of the soul. And according to the Gaudiya Vedanta idea, Shankar was this very powerful incarnation of Shiva who came to basically reestablish the faith in India, or in that region, with the Vedas, to reestablish their faith in the Vedas, and to establish the eternality of the soul. And then Bhaktivinoda says through the mouth of Prem Das Babaji that basically the followers of that, he for one thing he says is that Shankar never talked about the final attainment. He talked about spiritual life up to liberation and nothing after liberation. And that there's answering Sannyasi Thakur's questions, he said that there's a lot of similarities between Advaita Siddhi and Prem up to liberation, in a way that they both believe that we have eternal souls that have nothing actually to do with the material nature or the material influence, but that we're covered over by Maya. And liberation means to get out of that influence of Maya. And so up to that point, the two paths are basically the same. And he says, look at liberation from the point of view of completely releasing oneself from the material influence. Then you could, from that point of view, you could say that Advaita Siddhi is the same as Mahabhav. But then he goes further to explain that the fact is that Mahabhava is completely dependent on this idea of there being the lover, love, and the beloved, because you cannot have those prem-filled, love-filled dealings without having that dynamic of having the lover and the beloved, although they become one in love. Freeze number 3, right? Okay, back on. And so basically that's what he says. So then Sannyasi Thakur is very much convinced by this explanation, but then he has another doubt. He says, I understand that Krishna-prema is the nitya-dharma of the soul, but what should I make of the other religions in other cultures and countries? Like, how should I think about them? And now, so Prem Das Babaji says that Dharma is one, only one Dharma, and the measure of Vaishnava Dharma, because he made the point earlier that Vaishnava Dharma is the eternal function of the soul, And the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's explained in Srimad Bhagavatam what Vaishnava Dharma is. So now he says that Dharma is one, and the measure of Vaishnava Dharma in any religion or Dharma is the measure of its purity. And so then he cites this incident that happened to him, Premdas Babaji Maharaj. He tells the story to Sannyasi Thakur of how he met Sanatan Goswami in this assembly of highly advanced devotees. And Premdas Babaji asked this question to Sanatan Goswami. He specifically asked about the word ishq. Ishq, that means love in Arabic. And so because Sanatan Goswami was very well read in the Farsi language, or Parsi, I forget what name it is, but the Arabic languages, and knew the culture and everything. He asked this question to Sanatan Goswami, and basically his question was this word ishq, which means love in Arabic. Does that mean pure prem or something else? And then Sanatan Goswami said that it's referring to either like physical or mental love, and that although some Sufi and Muslim mystics use it in the context of pure love of God, it's not pure prem. And the same goes for the word ruh, which in Arabic means the soul. And Sanatan Goswami said that according to his understanding, they're actually talking about the Badhasi Jiva, or the conditioned soul, and not the Shuddha Jiva that has no contact with the material realm. And then he goes on to say that he has not seen unadulterated love for Krishna taught in any other religion, whereas descriptions of Krishna-prema are common throughout the teachings of Vaishnava Dharma. So, see, this all sounds, of course, highly sectarian, if you think about it from the point of view of somebody outside of our tradition, right? And before I became a devotee, the thing that most repelled me in organized religion was this fighting about who has the truth and how only our group has the truth and nobody else actually has it. Or that our group is the best and maybe we'll give some scraps for the other groups, but we're really the thing, we're the best thing. So like this kind of like sectarian biased view of other spiritual traditions based on your personal preferences, that really, really bothered me. And that's the case with most non-religious people in the world. So how do we then harmonize this in our own tradition, that it seems like Bhaktivinoda is basically saying that the real true spiritual substance is only found in full in our own tradition. Basically, he was saying that the followers of advaita-vedanta have completely distorted Shankaracharya's teachings. He said that Maya and that Buddhists are an extreme example of nitya-dharma, this like temporary religion. Basically, Muslims don't have pure prem. So where do we go with this? Well, one way that religious scholars break down the approach of religious traditions to other religious traditions is that they categorize it in three different categories. And the categories are exclusivity, inclusivity, and pluralism, you could say, or pluralistic views. And so if we make a quick, give some quick examples, the exclusive view, most of the traditional mainstream Abrahamic religions have an exclusive view. So basically it means our path is the only path. And actually every other path is demonic, really. Every other path, every other way of seeing the world and seeing life is trying to get us by temptation to get off the one true path. And there's only one attainment, which is the Abrahamic idea of heaven, and everybody else is going to hell. And that's like the most extreme form of an exclusive spiritual approach. And then the inclusive idea is that our path has the highest idea, but other people have, some good ideas too, but they are kind of like a little adulterated. But we have the original right idea of how things are, and other paths have some good things, but it's all in relation to the framework that we have about reality. And you could say that Gaudiya Vaishnavism is in that category, but I'll go further with that. But for now, let's say that we are in that inclusive category, which means that we tolerate other spiritual paths, but we think that they have a partial understanding of reality. And then the pluralistic understanding is that there are many paths to transcendence. And the most pluralistic ones say that every path actually leads to God. And in fact, Gita says this in a way. Krishna says directly that every person follows his path, that you can't, in one way or another, you're following the path of Krishna. And so that would be the pluralistic idea. And the general understanding is that Buddhists and advaita-vedanta fall in this pluralistic category because they say, well, there's many ways to practice. And then you'll end up in perfection eventually. But so this is where it gets really interesting. So I'll give you an example. I had a friend, one of my best friends from growing up. When I was a brahmachari, he contacted me and he said, I have become a Buddhist. And I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. He was very vaguely spiritual, but not very much. And I was like, well, that's pretty hardcore, because did you know that your ultimate goal is to completely cease to exist as a person? And he was like, wait, it's not saying that, is it? And I'm like, yeah, that is the path you identify with. And then he looked into it. He was like, yeah, I'm not a Buddhist. And it really cracked me up, because it really shows you how good, I mean, if you want to sound a little facetious, it really shows you how good the Buddhists actually are in their PR, that they get so many people to even like identify as Buddhists. And so many of them actually don't understand what the whole path is for. And so like Dalai Lama, for example, and I'm not dissing Buddhists. I'm just saying they're kind of doing their propaganda really well. But Dalai Lama, for example, has said it's better for you to probably just practice your own faith, whatever faith comes from your own culture, because that's more natural for you. So it seems completely pluralistic. Just do your thing and you'll be liberated, basically. But the thing is, if you dig deeper, the Buddhists are not saying that there are many different kinds of perfections. What they are saying is, no, we don't have a soul, but you can use different spiritual traditions to purify your consciousness so that you come closer to the Buddhist ideal of the Buddha consciousness. And so actually, that could be categorized as a exclusive. Look at the goal. It's actually, you could say, an exclusive path in a way. It talks about the final destination. And interestingly, the same applies to Advaita-vedanta. They say you can do bhakti if you're a little emotional, or you can do karma if you're attached to doing stuff, or you can do gyan if you're the cool guys who just can sit and meditate. But then when you look at the final destination, it's all one. There is no different types of perfection. And again, a seemingly pluralistic tradition is actually exclusive in the way of its final destination. It's all the same thing. But then come the sectarian Gaudiyas, right? And if you look at the final destination of the Gaudiyas, it's really unique. You can actually merge with Brahman if you want to. That's Brahma Siddhi. Or there's Prakriti Nirvana. You can merge with the material existence and will apparently cease to exist. I don't think Gaudiyas would say that the soul can actually be, we wouldn't say that. So, but anyway, you can have the experience of the Brahma Nirvana. And there's a whole variety of different kinds of attainments in transcendence. I mean, Srila Siddhar Maharaj went as far as to say that there's this like Jesus Loka somewhere in the Vaikuntha, realm, this like planet where Jesus is kind of like the Vishnu of the center of the whole thing, and the people who are really their Ishtadev is Jesus, they go there. And I mean, of course, that's not anywhere in the Veda. It was either his projection or his generosity. So what I'm trying to say is, actually, when you don't focus on the way Gaudiya Vaishnavism plays out in the world, but you look at what the final destination is, it's extremely pluralistic. And that's such a far out idea, actually, that the final destination is not one and the same for all the souls. But the basis of it is the same, like Prem Das Babaji was explaining earlier, that up to the point of moksha, it is the same. We have absolutely nothing to do with the material reality. But then once you go across that border, you can have different kinds of destinations for an eternity. And they're all, from one point of view, they're all just as perfect. And that's just such a far out idea. And when we start feeling like Gaudiya Vaishnavism is sectarian, like you read the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it seems like it's bashing like every other tradition, it's really good to focus on the final goal and how extremely accommodating it is in that way. And one funny thing I wanted to mention about this was that we normally tend to think that Buddhists are pluralist, but I just recently heard that there are, my understanding is, many Buddhist sects that read all these other traditions and other gods and saints the same way that Gaudiya Vaishnavism says that, for example, that yes, Jesus was a guru. Can you hear me? Okay. So my point was that basically, like the way Gaudiya Vaishnavism kind of subsumes other traditions into its own canon by saying like, okay, Buddha was actually an incarnation of Krishna and Sankar was an incarnation of Vishnu. The Buddhists have a similar thing. Certain sects, they say that, for example, that Krishna was actually this one type of Buddha who came to the world to preach Buddha Dharma in a way that was accessible to that people of that culture and time. So they turn the same thing exactly upside down and say the same thing about our goal, what we might say about them. So this thing seems to go on a lot. But anyway, I think I'm going to leave it there. And I wasn't able to go through everything I was going to go through, but it's getting late and I wanted to open it up if you guys have any comments or questions. This is a pretty hot topic in a lot of ways. At least I would imagine it is. So maybe there's some comments or questions. Let's see. Oh.
Hare Krishna.
Haribo.
Can I have a question?
Mm-hmm.
So like the people are not like buying those things like that you say that Buddha is just Krishna, as you mentioned, because they have such deep rooted like this Voidistic philosophy, or how to say it. So what is the only way? Is only just to bring them somehow the experience, or how you can explain them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically we create samskars by the practice that we do. And so we have bhakti samskars, Buddhists have their particular samskars, and advaita-vedantins have their samskars. And so it's very hard to like break through and have a sense of the other path samskars, I suppose. So it's very hard to like give a taste of, let's say, like we might sometimes have this taste for chanting, for example. We feel bliss, and that can actually happen to people who don't believe in the Shuddha Bhakti tradition, because it's the holy name is so powerful that happens. And that's why even Mayavadis or Brahmagyanis, they use the Maha Mantra sometimes to meditate, or they do kirtan, for example. But to have that like actual like flash of like our relationship with God, and that little like bhava bhasa or whatever comes when we sometimes have these peak experiences, I don't really know how to share that, because it's based on this certain framework and this certain sambandha. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have the same experience. So I really don't have an answer. But of course, then one question is, if there is any kind of objective yardstick to compare different traditions. And this is always a little bit of a slippery slope, because we're like bound to kind of see things from our own perspective as human beings. But one way you could look at this is that the idea of, it's called rasa vichar. So you what's the vichar in English? You kind of like view, I can't find the word, but anyway, you discriminate based on rasa, the idea of spiritual rasa or nectar, or whatever you want, however you want to translate it. And if that's your yardstick, then it seems clear that they're just, at least I don't know of any other path. And I don't want to be sectarian. That's one thing I really dislike personally. So I'm not saying this from a sectarian standpoint. But if you just, I mean, I've never seen any other tradition that has this kind of emphasis on the ras, the like pure ecstasy and love for God, that is so close that God shows up in these like seemingly everyday forms. And so I guess it comes down to, what do you want spiritually? If you want complete peace, and like if you just want to merge with everything, then Buddhism is your path. But if you feel like the ras, or the taste of love of God, this like pure and unadulterated love and connection with the absolute is what you want, then Gaudiya Vaishnavism is like a great path. And I guess that comes down to what I was talking about earlier, that there are different perfections. And so in that way, you could say that you just pick one and go for it. So I don't know, I'm kind of like thinking out loud, but I can't really give any good answer to how to give them that taste. I mean, you can give them prasad, I guess, but there's some taste for you. I don't know. A good question. I don't have any ready answers, really.
Yeah, thank you very much. This rasa vichar.
Yeah, it's a nice way of looking at it. Anything else? Let me do a real quick survey. You can say yes or no in the chat if these topics are uncomfortable for you. Well, that's very nice. So far, everybody has said no, not uncomfortable. Oh, yes, uncomfortable. Always saying how this is like, just shows how all religions are just like ridiculous, that they fight over these things and they all say they are right, but it's really just a lack of like a broader perspective on how there are these different viewpoints. And if you think about a lot of the Abrahamic religions, maybe they need it for their faith to be so exclusivist. I mean, it's quite extreme, and it's very unfortunate when it plays out into actual acts of violence and things like that. But if you only think about what they need for their faith, it can be extremely powerful to feel like you're the ones, the whole world is, going to hell, and we're gonna, fast track to heaven. And I mean, it's of course a lot of times, I know many Christians kind of feel bad about the idea that everybody else is going to burn in hell and everything. And there's, they have good hearts and everything, but it can be very powerful in terms of just boosting your faith, basically. And from that point of view, even that exclusive idea can be a positive, although I wouldn't say this to my most friends, but from the point of view, if you understand faith and if you relate to purifying your existence and going to this better state of existence, then that can be seen as a positive thing that has some very negative consequences sometimes. Anything else? Okay, I've probably talked enough. That's it. One small announcement is that Guru Maharaj and Padmanabh Maharaj are going to start giving classes on the 20th. So I am going to stop giving these classes for that time period. It's going to be a month. And then I'm going to continue from where we left off today on I think the 20th of January or something like that. So I very much hope to see you all there. So I very much enjoy this. Appreciate this opportunity to be able to talk about these things with you guys. And I very much appreciate you having the tolerance to listen to me babble. So let's carry it and keep it on. And thanks so much. Gaudiya Premanande. Haribo.